The sharp crack of a Winchester rifle split the evening air as Abigail Montgomery ducked behind a fallen oak, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild mustang. Blood trickled down her arm where the bullet had grazed her, but she couldn't afford to tend to it now, not with Holden's men still combing the foothills. 3 days on the run had left her parched, exhausted, and terrified, but determination kept her moving through the rugged terrain of the Arizona Territory. It was 1876, and the promise of a new life had turned into a nightmare the moment her stagecoach was ambushed outside Tucson. The other passengers, all men traveling to the silver mines, had been killed outright. Only Abigail had managed to escape, slipping away in the chaos after witnessing the ruthless Holden brothers murder the driver in cold blood. Night was falling fast, bringing with it the desert's bitter cold. Abigail's simple traveling dress offered little protection against the elements, and exhaustion pulled at her limbs like lead weights. In the distance, she spotted a flicker of orange light, a campfire. Hope and fear warred within her. It could be Holden's men, waiting to finish what they'd started. Or it could be salvation. With no choice left, she crept toward the light, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. As she drew closer, she made out a solitary figure tending the flames, a man with broad shoulders and a well-worn hat pulled low over his eyes. A horse was tethered nearby, along with a pack mule laden with supplies. Not the Holden gang, then. They traveled in packs like the wolves they resembled. Gathering what little courage remained, Abigail stepped into the circle of firelight. The man's hand moved lightning fast to the pistol at his hip before recognition flashed in his eyes, not of her specifically, but of what she was. A woman alone and in trouble. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking from thirst and fear. "They're after me." The stranger rose in a fluid motion, his weathered face illuminated by the dancing flames. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his mid-30s, with deep lines etched around eyes the color of a summer storm. A thick beard streaked with hints of gray couldn't hide the strong set of his jaw. "Who's after you, madam?" His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling down a hillside. "The Holden brothers," she replied, watching as his expression darkened. The name was clearly known to him. Without another word, he moved toward her, supporting her weight as her knees finally buckled. He helped her to a seat on a bedroll near the fire and pressed a canteen into her trembling hands. "Drink slow," he instructed. "Name's Griffin Wade." "Abigail Montgomery," she managed between careful sips of the cool water. "They killed everyone else. I've been running for days." Griffin nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of light. He moved with practiced efficiency, checking his weapons, adjusting the fire to minimize its visibility, and finally returning to crouch before her. "You're safe for now," he said, examining the wound on her arm with gentle fingers. "It's not deep, but it needs cleaning." As he tended to her injury with supplies from his saddlebag, Abigail studied him through half-closed eyes. His hands were calloused but surprisingly gentle, and despite her fear, she felt the first flicker of safety she'd experienced in days. "Thank you," she murmured as he finished binding her arm with a clean strip of cloth. Griffin merely nodded, his expression unreadable in the firelight. He handed her a piece of jerky and a tin cup of coffee that smelled like heaven itself. "Eat, then rest." As Abigail gratefully accepted the simple meal, Griffin settled himself on the opposite side of the fire, his rifle across his knees, gaze fixed on the darkness beyond. "I don't want to sleep alone tonight," he said suddenly, his eyes meeting hers across the flames. "Or any night after," the cowboy told the weary woman at his fire. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. "I don't understand." Griffin's weathered face softened slightly. The Holdens don't give up easy. I'm saying we stick together. Safety in numbers. I'm headed north to my brother's ranch in Wyoming territory. You're welcome to join me until we find somewhere safe for you." Relief washed over her like a summer rain. "Thank you," she whispered again, this time with tears threatening to spill. "Get some sleep, Miss Montgomery. I'll keep watch." As Abigail settled onto the bedroll Griffin had offered, pulling a rough wool blanket around her shoulders, she watched him through the flames. His profile was strong against the night sky, vigilant and steady. For the first time in days, she allowed her eyes to close, knowing she wasn't alone anymore. The morning dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the desert scrub in delicate white patterns. Abigail woke with a start, momentarily disoriented until her eyes found Griffin, methodically preparing coffee over a small fire. "Morning," he said, noticing her stirring. "We should move soon. Holden's men will be widening their search." Abigail sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. "How far are we from civilization?" "3 days' ride to the nearest town worth mentioning," Griffin replied, handing her a tin cup of steaming coffee. "Hope you're comfortable in the saddle." "I grew up on a farm in Missouri," she said, accepting the cup gratefully. "I can ride." Griffin nodded approvingly. "Good. That'll make things easier." He hesitated, then asked, "Why are the Holdens after you specifically? They don't usually bother with survivors unless there's a reason." Abigail's hands tightened around the warm cup. "I witnessed them murder the stagecoach driver and the other passengers. But there's more." She hesitated, unsure whether to trust this stranger with the full truth. Griffin waited patiently, his gray eyes steady on hers. "I was traveling to meet my uncle in San Francisco," she continued. "He sent for me after my parents died. The influenza took them both last winter." She swallowed hard. "My father was a banker. Before he died, he entrusted me with documents that could implicate several powerful men in land fraud across the territories." Understanding dawned in Griffin's eyes. "And the Holdens work for these men?" "Yes. Somehow they discovered I was carrying the papers. They attacked the stagecoach specifically to find me." She reached into her boot and withdrew a small oilskin packet. "Everything's here. Names, dates, falsified deeds enough to send several territorial officials to prison." Griffin whistled softly. "No wonder they're hunting you so hard." He stood, pouring the remainder of his coffee onto the ground. "We need to move. Now." They broke camp quickly, Griffin efficiently packing his supplies while Abigail folded the bedroll. He led a sturdy paint mare from where she'd been grazing nearby. "This is Calico," he said, patting the horse's neck. "She's steady and sure-footed. She'll carry you well." Abigail approached the mare, allowing the animal to sniff her hand before stroking her soft muzzle. "She's beautiful." "She's yours for the journey," Griffin said, already securing his belongings to his own mount, a powerful black stallion with a white blaze down his face. "That's Demon," he added, noticing her looking. "Don't let the name fool you. He's just got spirit." With practiced ease, Griffin helped Abigail into the saddle, adjusting the stirrups to accommodate her height. His hands were warm through the fabric of her dress, steadying her as she settled. "Thank you again," she said, looking down at him. "I don't know what I would have done if—" "No need for that," he interrupted gruffly. "Let's just focus on keeping ahead of the Holdens." They rode north, keeping to rough country where their tracks would be harder to follow. Griffin set a steady pace, occasionally glancing back to ensure Abigail was managing. She rode well, her back straight despite her obvious fatigue, and he found himself impressed by her resilience. Around midday, they paused in a shallow canyon to rest the horses and eat a sparse meal of jerky and hardtack. Abigail grimaced at the tasteless food but ate without complaint. You never said what brings you out here alone, she ventured, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Griffin's expression closed slightly. Was visiting my brother's grave in Tucson, heading back to Wyoming now. I'm sorry, Abigail said softly, recognizing the fresh grief in his voice. Was it recent? 2 weeks ago. Fever took him. Griffin's jaw tightened. He was all the family I had left. Abigail nodded, understanding the hollow ache of loss all too well. My parents were everything to me, she offered. Some days I still can't believe they're gone. For a moment, their eyes met in shared understanding of grief too fresh to have scarred over yet. Then Griffin stood, breaking the connection. We should keep moving, he said, helping her to her feet. There's a spring about 5 miles north where we can refill the canteens. As they continued their journey, Abigail found herself studying Griffin's broad back as he rode ahead of her. There was a solidity to him that comforted her, a steadiness she hadn't realized she'd been craving since her world had collapsed. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as they climbed out of the canyon lands into rolling hills, sparsely dotted with juniper and piñon pine. Twice Griffin halted abruptly, signaling for silence as he studied their back trail, but each time he eventually relaxed and they moved on. By evening, Abigail was swaying in the saddle, exhaustion finally overcoming her determination. Without a word, Griffin led them into a sheltered grove of cottonwoods beside a small, clear stream, a blessed sight after the day's dusty travel. We'll camp here, he announced, dismounting in one fluid motion. He was at Abigail's side immediately, strong hands lifting her from the saddle when her legs threatened to buckle beneath her. I've got you, he murmured, his voice unexpectedly gentle as he supported her weight. For a moment, Abigail allowed herself to lean against his solid chest, drawing strength from his steadiness. Thank you, she whispered, embarrassed by her weakness but too tired to pretend otherwise. Griffin set about making camp with practiced efficiency, refusing Abigail's offers of help. Rest, he insisted. You've had a hard few days. Despite her exhaustion, Abigail couldn't bring herself to simply sit idle. She gathered what firewood she could find nearby, listening to Griffin's soft murmurs as he tended to the horses. That night, as they sat beside another small fire, Griffin surprised her by producing a small pot of beans and salt pork from his supplies. The hot food was the most delicious thing Abigail had tasted in days, and she didn't bother hiding her appreciation. This is wonderful, she said between eager bites. You're well prepared for travel. A ghost of a smile touched Griffin's lips. Been on the trail most of my life. You learn what matters. And what matters? Abigail asked, genuinely curious. Griffin considered her question seriously. Good horse, reliable weapons, knowing how to find water. He paused, his eyes meeting hers across the fire. Someone to watch your back doesn't hurt either. Is that what you're doing, watching my back? Seems like you need it, he replied simply. They fell into companionable silence as night deepened around them. Griffin insisted Abigail take the bedroll again while he kept first watch, promising to wake her for the second half of the night. I won't have you exhausting yourself on my account, she protested. I sleep light, he countered. Always have. Now rest. Despite her intention to stay awake, Abigail drifted off almost immediately, lulled by the gentle sounds of the stream and Griffin's occasional movements as he tended the fire. She woke suddenly hours later, heart pounding, uncertain what had disturbed her sleep. Griffin was instantly at her side, his hand warm on her shoulder. Easy, he whispered. Just a coyote passing by. Abigail nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. I thought it might be, not yet, Griffin assured her, but they're coming. No doubt about that. In the soft glow of the banked fire, his face was all plains and shadows, his eyes reflecting pinpoints of light. Without thinking, Abigail reached up to touch his bearded cheek. "Why are you helping me?" she asked softly. "You could have sent me on my way this morning." "The Holdens have no quarrel with you." Griffin captured her hand in his calloused fingers engulfing hers. For a long moment, he simply held her gaze in the darkness. "I've seen enough good people die," he finally said. "And you remind me of someone I used to know." "Who?" Abigail couldn't help asking. Griffin released her hand gently. "Someone I couldn't save." He moved back to his position near the fire. "Try to sleep. Dawn's still hours away." Despite her curiosity, Abigail respected his obvious reluctance to speak further. She settled back onto the bedroll, but sleep remained elusive as she pondered the mysterious cowboy who had so unexpectedly become her protector. The next morning brought a change in the weather, with heavy clouds rolling in from the west, promising rain. Griffin studied the sky with a frown as they prepared to leave. "We'll need to make good time today," he said, securing their supplies. "Storm's coming, and we don't want to be caught in open country." Abigail nodded, already feeling more confident in the saddle as she mounted Calico. "Where are we headed?" "There's an old line shack about 20 miles north," Griffin replied, swinging onto Demon's back. "Used to belong to the Bar T Ranch before they went under, should still be standing." They rode in companionable silence for much of the morning, climbing steadily into more rugged country. The terrain was beautiful in its stark way, red rock formations thrusting up from the earth, deep canyons carved by ancient waters, and scattered pines growing improbably from seemingly barren soil. Around noon, fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a steady downpour that soaked through their clothing. Griffin led them beneath an overhanging cliff face where they could shelter temporarily. "Might pass quickly," he said, dismounting and helping Abigail down. "Desert storms often do." Huddled together beneath the meager shelter, they shared jerky and the last of the morning's coffee, now cold but welcome nonetheless. Abigail shivered, her dress clinging uncomfortably to her skin. Without comment, Griffin shrugged out of his duster and draped it around her shoulders. The heavy canvas was warm from his body, and she pulled it gratefully around herself. "Won't you be cold?" she asked, concerned. Griffin shook his head. "I'm used to worse." Standing close together, watching the rain pound the desert floor, Abigail became acutely aware of the man beside her. Despite his rough exterior, there was a gentleness to Griffin Wade that she found increasingly appealing. His quiet strength was a balm to her frayed nerves, and she found herself stealing glances at his profile when she thought he wouldn't notice. "Your uncle in San Francisco," Griffin said suddenly. "Is he expecting you by a certain date?" Abigail shook her head. "He knows travel times are unpredictable, but he'll worry if I'm too delayed. And these papers you're carrying there that important?" "Important enough that men are willing to kill for them," she replied grimly. "My father discovered the fraud when a family friend lost their homestead to a falsified claim. He spent months gathering evidence before he fell ill." Griffin nodded slowly. "Brave man, your father." "He believed in justice," Abigail said simply. "As do I." "Justice is a fine ideal," Griffin remarked, his tone suggesting personal experience with its limitations, "but it's often in short supply out here." "That's why these papers matter," Abigail insisted. "If good people do nothing, then men like those behind the Holdens will continue to profit at others' expense." Griffin studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Fair point." The rain eventually slackened, and they continued their journey, pushing the horses as much as the muddy conditions would allow. By late afternoon, dark clouds still hung low over the landscape, but at least the downpour had ceased. "There," Griffin pointed toward a distant ridgeline. The lined shack should be just beyond that rise. Relief flooded through Abigail at the prospect of dry shelter for the night. Her clothes had begun to dry uncomfortably against her skin, chafing with each movement of the horse. As they crested the ridge, the simple log structure came into view, small but solid, with a stone chimney rising from its sloped roof. Griffin approached cautiously, signaling for Abigail to wait while he scouted the immediate area. Satisfied they were alone, he helped her dismount and led the horses to a lean-to attached to one side of the cabin. Inside, the shack was dusty but intact, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough plank table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed frame with a straw-filled mattress in one corner. "It's not much," Griffin said, watching Abigail's reaction. "It's perfect," she replied sincerely, relief evident in her voice. "A roof and walls feel like luxury right now." Griffin set about starting a fire while Abigail explored their temporary shelter. A shelf held basic supplies: salt, coffee, beans, and flour left by previous occupants, while pegs on the wall supported cast iron cookware. "Seems we're in luck," she said, examining the provisions. "I could make biscuits to go with whatever you have planned for dinner." Griffin looked up from the now crackling fire, surprise evident in his expression. "You don't have to cook." "I want to," Abigail insisted. "It would feel good to do something useful after being such a burden." "You're not a burden," Griffin said firmly, rising to his feet. "I'll check on the horses and bring in our supplies. Make yourself at home." As he stepped outside, Abigail set about preparing a simple meal, grateful for the chance to engage in such a normal activity after days of fear and flight. She found a bucket, and after confirming with Griffin when he returned, fetched water from a nearby spring to mix with the flour for biscuits. Working together in the small space, they fell into an easy rhythm, Griffin adding wood to the fire and preparing his meager provisions, while Abigail kneaded dough and arranged it in a cast iron skillet to bake in the fireplace. The domestic scene struck Abigail as surreal after the dangers they'd faced. Here they were, like any frontier couple, preparing an evening meal while rain pattered softly on the roof overhead. "This reminds me of home," she said softly, watching Griffin slice salt pork into a pot of beans. "My mother and I would cook together every evening while my father read aloud from whatever book he was enjoying." Griffin's hands paused momentarily. "Sounds peaceful." "It was," Abigail agreed, a familiar ache of loss tightening her chest, "until the influenza came." "Then nothing was peaceful again," Griffin nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Losing family changes you." "Yes," Abigail agreed, "though I suspect you knew that long before your brother passed." Griffin's gaze sharpened on her face. "What makes you say that?" "Something in the way you carry yourself," she replied honestly. "Like you're used to standing alone." For a long moment Griffin was silent, and Abigail feared she'd overstepped. Then he sighed, setting down his knife. "My parents died when I was 16. Comanche raid on our homestead," he said, his voice matter-of-fact despite the tragedy it conveyed. "My brother and I survived because we were hunting. Came home to find everything gone." "I'm so sorry," Abigail whispered, imagining the horror of such a return. Griffin shrugged, the gesture belying the pain she knew such a loss must have caused. "It was 20 years ago. We made our way, found work on ranches, learned to survive. And now," Abigail asked gently, "now I have a small spread in Wyoming. Nothing fancy, couple 100 acres, small herd of cattle. It's enough." He turned back to his task, clearly uncomfortable with sharing more. Their meal, when ready, was simple but satisfying: beans with salt pork, biscuits golden from the fire, and strong coffee. They ate in companionable silence, the rain creating a soothing backdrop to the crackling of the fire. As Abigail gathered their empty plates, her fingers brushed against Griffin's, sending an unexpected warmth up her arm. Their eyes met briefly, and something shifted in the air between them, an acknowledgement of connection that transcended their circumstances. Griffin cleared his throat, rising abruptly. "You should take the bed. I'll manage fine by the fire." "There's no need for that," Abigail protested. "I've been sleeping on the ground for days. The floor by the fire is perfectly acceptable." "I insist," Griffin said firmly. "Besides, I need to keep watch. The Holdens might have tracked us, despite the rain." Abigail wanted to argue further but recognized the stubborn set of his jaw. Instead, she nodded her acceptance and began preparing for sleep, acutely aware of Griffin's presence as he checked his weapons and positioned himself near the door. That night, as wind whistled around the corners of the cabin and rain continued its steady patter on the roof, Abigail lay awake on the narrow bed, listening to Griffin's occasional movements as he tended the fire. Despite the relative comfort of their shelter, sleep proved elusive as her mind raced with questions about her enigmatic protector and what the coming days might hold. She must have dozed eventually, for she woke with a start to find pale morning light filtering through the cabin's single window. Griffin was already up, his hat and coat suggesting he'd been outside. "Storm's past," he announced, setting a bucket of fresh water on the table. "But it's left its mark. Trails will be muddy, which works in our favor. Harder for the Holdens to track us." Abigail sat up, pushing hair from her face. "Have you seen any sign of them?" Griffin shook his head. "Nothing yet, but they're out there." They shared a quick breakfast of leftover biscuits and coffee before preparing to depart. As Abigail helped gather their few belongings, she noticed Griffin studying a tattered map spread on the table. "Change of plans," he said, tracing a route with his finger. "We're too exposed heading straight north. I'm thinking we cut northeast through the mountains." "Longer route, but less chance of running into trouble." Abigail moved to his side, examining the map. "How much longer?" 3, maybe 4 extra days, Griffin admitted. "But there's a settlement here," he tapped a spot on the map, "where we might find better provisions and maybe news about the Holden's movements." "I trust your judgment," Abigail said simply, and she realized she meant it. In the short time she'd known Griffin Wade, he had earned her complete confidence through his actions and steadfast protection. Griffin folded the map, his expression unreadable. "Let's hope it's warranted." They set out under clearing skies, the desert washed clean by the night's rain. Wildflowers had already begun to appear, tiny splashes of color against the red earth, as if the landscape itself was celebrating the moisture. The new route took them into increasingly rugged territory, climbing steadily into pine-covered foothills. Griffin set a careful pace, mindful of the horses on the slippery terrain, occasionally dismounting to lead Demon through particularly treacherous sections and instructing Abigail to do the same with Calico. By mid-afternoon, they had gained enough elevation that Abigail could look back and see the vast expanse of desert stretching away to the horizon. The view was breathtaking, stark, beautiful, and somehow both inviting and forbidding at once. "It's magnificent," she murmured, pausing to take in the panorama. Griffin reined Demon to a halt beside her. "Beautiful and deadly," he agreed, his eyes scanning the distance. Then he stiffened, his gaze fixing on something in the far distance. "What is it?" Abigail asked, alarm rising in her throat. "Dust," Griffin said grimly, pointing to what appeared to be a faint smudge on the horizon. "Riders, moving fast." Abigail's heart began to race. "The Holdens? Can't be sure from this distance, but we shouldn't wait to find out." Griffin turned Demon back toward the trail. "We need to keep moving. The terrain will slow them down once they reach the foothills." They pushed on with renewed urgency, climbing higher into the mountains as the afternoon waned. The forest grew denser, providing better cover but making progress slower as they navigated between close-set pines and over fallen logs. As dusk approached, Griffin led them off the main trail into a small clearing partially screened by a thicket of junipers. "We'll make camp here," he decided. "No fire tonight." Abigail dismounted stiffly, her muscles protesting after the long day's ride. "Do you think they're still following?" Griffin unsaddled Demon, his movements quick and efficient. "If it's the Holdens, they're determined, but they won't risk these trails in darkness." "We've bought ourselves the night, at least." They made a cold camp, sharing jerky and hardtack in the gathering darkness. Without a fire, the mountain night quickly turned cold, and Abigail found herself shivering despite Griffin's duster, which he'd again insisted she wear. "Here," Griffin said, noticing her discomfort. He unrolled his bedroll and motioned for her to sit, then settled beside her, his solid presence blocking the worst of the evening breeze. "Body heat," he explained simply. "Best way to stay warm." Tentatively, Abigail leaned against his side, immediately grateful for the warmth radiating from him. After a moment's hesitation, Griffin's arm came around her shoulders, drawing her closer. "Thank you," she murmured, relaxing gradually into his embrace. "For everything. I'd likely be dead by now if not for you." Griffin was silent for a long moment, his breathing steady against her. "I know what it's like to be hunted," he finally said, his voice low in the darkness. "No one should face that alone." Abigail tilted her head to look up at him, barely able to make out his features in the faint starlight filtering through the trees. "You've been hunted." A hesitation then. "After my parents died, my brother and I tracked the Comanche who raided our homestead. We were young, angry, and foolish. We killed 3 of them before their friends started hunting us." "What happened?" Abigail asked softly. "We almost didn't make it," Griffin admitted. "Would have died if not for an old trapper who found us half-starved in the mountains. He taught us how to survive, how to stay ahead of those tracking us. And the Comanche, eventually they gave up the hunt, or maybe they died, we never knew for certain." Griffin's arm tightened fractionally around her. "But I learned valuable lessons, how to read sign, how to cover my trail, when to hide and when to run. Skills that are saving my life now," Abigail observed. Griffin made a noncommittal sound, but she felt him nod in the darkness. They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. The only sounds the soft nickering of the horses and the whisper of wind through the pines. Despite the danger that pursued them, Abigail felt strangely peaceful in Griffin's embrace, as if she'd found a harbor in the midst of a storm. "You should try to sleep," Griffin eventually murmured against her hair. "I'll keep watch." "You need rest too," Abigail protested. "You can't go on like this indefinitely." "I'm fine," he insisted. Years of trail life teaches a man to function on little sleep, but Abigail was equally stubborn. "At least lie down with me. You can still keep watch, and I'll feel better knowing you're getting some rest." After a brief hesitation, Griffin acquiesced. They arranged the bedroll as comfortably as possible on the forest floor, and Abigail found herself lying beside Griffin, his arm still protectively around her, her head pillowed on his shoulder. It should have felt improper scandalous even to be in such an intimate position with a man she barely knew. Yet it felt entirely natural, as if they'd found the arrangement they were always meant to have. "Griffin," she whispered into the darkness. His voice rumbled beneath her ear. "When this is over, what happens then?" He was silent for so long that Abigail thought he might have fallen asleep despite his insistence on keeping watch. Finally, he spoke, his voice uncommonly gentle. "That depends on you, I reckon. You still aiming for San Francisco?" "I don't know any more," Abigail admitted. "Everything's changed so quickly. A week ago I had my life planned out. Now, Griffin prompted when she didn't continue. Abigail sighed, uncertain how to express the confusion of emotions that had developed over their short time together. Now I'm not sure of anything except that I'm grateful to be alive, and to have met you. Griffin's arm tightened around her, but he said nothing more. Eventually, Abigail drifted into sleep, lulled by the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her cheek. Morning came too soon, gray light filtering through the trees and a chorus of birdsong announcing the new day. Abigail woke to find herself still nestled against Griffin, who was awake and watching her with an unreadable expression. "You stayed," she murmured, oddly touched that he hadn't moved away during the night. "Said I would," he replied simply. They broke camp quickly, both aware that their pursuers could resume the hunt at any moment. The day's travel took them deeper into the mountains, following game trails that sometimes disappeared entirely, forcing Griffin to navigate by instinct and experience alone. Around midday, they emerged from dense forest onto a high ridge that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. Griffin reined in, surveying the landscape with narrowed eyes. "There," he said, pointing to a distant cluster of buildings nestled in a gentle fold of land. "That's Pinecrest, the settlement I mentioned." Abigail shaded her eyes, studying the small town. "It looks peaceful." "For now," Griffin agreed. "But we need to be careful. The Holdens have friends in unexpected places." They approached Pinecrest cautiously, staying in the cover of the trees until they were certain the town appeared normal, with no unusual activity that might signal danger. It was a small settlement, little more than a general store, a livery, a saloon, and a scattering of cabins stretching along a single dusty street. "We'll need supplies," Griffin said as they prepared to enter the town. "And information. But we keep to ourselves, understand?" No mentioning the Holdens or why we're traveling. Abigail nodded, adjusting her disheveled appearance as best she could. "What's our story if anyone asks?" Griffin considered for a moment. "Husband and wife traveling to visit family in Wyoming." He glanced at her, a question in his eyes. "That work for you?" A flush of warmth crept up Abigail's neck at the suggestion, but she nodded. "That seems sensible." They rode into town at an unhurried pace, trying to project the appearance of ordinary travelers rather than fugitives. Several townspeople glanced their way with mild curiosity, but no one seemed particularly interested in their arrival. Griffin led them directly to the livery, where an elderly man with a pronounced limp emerged to greet them. "Afternoon, folks," he called, squinting up at them. "Need stabling for those fine animals, just for a few hours," Griffin replied, dismounting and helping Abigail down. "We're passing through, need to resupply before heading north." The liveryman nodded, taking the reins Griffin offered. "North, eh? Heading to Wyoming by any chance?" "Heard there's good land opening up that way." Griffin's expression remained neutral, but Abigail felt him tense slightly beside her. "That's right. My wife and I are visiting family there." The old man glanced between them, his gaze lingering on Abigail's travel-worn appearance. "Well, you'll find everything you need at Mercer's store across the way. Tell him old Pete sent you. Might save you a penny or two." "Obliged," Griffin said, guiding Abigail away with a gentle hand at the small of her back. "He seemed harmless enough," Abigail murmured as they crossed the street toward the general store. "Maybe," Griffin conceded, "but I don't like that he guessed our destination." Inside Mercer's general store, they found a well-stocked establishment with goods ranging from basic provisions to small luxuries rarely seen in frontier settlements. A portly man with impressive mutton chop whiskers greeted them from behind a polished counter. "Welcome, travelers. Albert Mercer at your service. What can I help you with today?" Griffin listed their needs efficiently: coffee, flour, beans, jerky, ammunition for his Winchester, and a few other essentials. While the storekeeper gathered their supplies, Abigail wandered the store, suddenly acutely aware of her bedraggled state as she fingered clean calico dresses and sturdy work clothes. "Find something you like, Mrs. Mercer prompted, noticing her interest. "Wade," Griffin supplied before Abigail could respond. "My wife could use a fresh dress for the journey, I reckon." Abigail turned in surprise, but Griffin merely gave her a small nod. "Pick what you need," he added softly. Grateful beyond words, Abigail selected a simple blue calico dress, a warm shawl, and basic necessities that made her feel human again just knowing they would be hers. Griffin added them to their purchases without comment, though she saw him counting their dwindling funds with concern. As Mercer wrapped their goods, he chatted amicably. "You folks are lucky, coming through today. Road East has been closed for repairs after that big storm, and we had some rough characters pass through yesterday, headed west, not the sort you'd want to meet on a lonely trail." Griffin's hand stilled on the counter. "That's so. What kind of characters?" Mercer leaned forward conspiratorially. "4 men heavily armed, led by a fellow with a scar down his cheek, mean-looking bunch. Said they were looking for army deserters, but I've been around long enough to know bounty hunters when I see them." Abigail's blood ran cold. The description matched the Holden brothers perfectly. "Which way did they head?" Griffin asked, his tone casual despite the tension Abigail could see in his shoulders. "West, like I said, toward Clearwater Junction." Mercer finished parceling their supplies. "That'll be $8.42, Mr. Wade." Griffin paid without haggling, his mind clearly elsewhere. They left the store with their purchases, Griffin's expression grim as they stepped back onto the street. "They think we went west," Abigail whispered, hope rising in her chest. "We've thrown them off our trail." "For now," Griffin cautioned, "but they'll figure it out eventually. We need to keep moving." They collected their horses from the livery, Griffin exchanging a few more words with old Pete while Abigail secured their supplies. Within an hour of entering Pinecrest, they were riding out again, heading northeast toward higher mountains. "We should find a place to stop early," Griffin suggested as they left the town behind. "Give you a chance to change, rest properly. We've pushed hard these past days." Abigail nodded gratefully. The prospect of clean clothing and a few hours of respite was enormously appealing. By late afternoon, they found what Griffin deemed a suitable campsite, a small clearing beside a tumbling mountain stream, sheltered by towering pines and a natural rock formation that would reflect a fire's heat, while minimizing its visibility from a distance. "This is perfect," Abigail said, dismounting with Griffin's assistance. "And beautiful." Griffin nodded, already unpacking their supplies. "I'll get a fire started. There's a pool just upstream that's deep enough for bathing if you'd like to wash up first." The thought of washing away days of dust and fear was too tempting to resist. Gathering her new dress and the bar of soap Griffin offered, Abigail made her way upstream to where the creek widened into a clear, knee-deep pool. The water was breathtakingly cold, but after the initial shock, Abigail found it invigorating. She washed quickly, scrubbing her skin and hair until she felt truly clean for the first time in days. Changing into the fresh dress was a simple pleasure that brought tears to her eyes, a reminder of normal life amid their extraordinary circumstances. When she returned to camp, her damp hair hanging in a neat braid down her back, she found Griffin had created a cozy haven. A small fire crackled cheerfully, coffee was brewing in a battered pot, and he had arranged her bedroll near the warmth of the flames. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression made her heart skip. For a moment, he simply stared, as if seeing her properly for the first time. "You look." He cleared his throat. "The dress suits you." "Thank you," Abigail replied, unexpectedly shy under his gaze. "And thank you for buying it. I'll repay you when I can." Griffin waved away her promise. "No need. Consider it part of our arrangement." "Our arrangement?" she questioned, settling on her bedroll. "Safety in numbers, remember?" Griffin handed her a cup of coffee. "Besides, I reckon I've gotten as much from your company as you have from my protection." The simple statement warmed Abigail more than the fire before her. "I'm glad to hear it." They shared a peaceful meal as twilight deepened around them. The tension of the past days temporarily eased by the knowledge that their pursuers were searching in the wrong direction. For the first time since their meeting, conversation flowed easily between them, moving beyond immediate dangers to personal histories and small revelations. Abigail learned that Griffin had fought briefly for the Confederacy before deserting, unable to reconcile the cause with his conscience. He'd spent the war years working cattle drives across the territories, eventually saving enough to purchase his small ranch in Wyoming. In turn, she told him of her childhood in Missouri, her father's work as a banker, and her mother's passion for education that had ensured Abigail received schooling unusual for a frontier woman. "Is that why you were heading to San Francisco?" Griffin asked. "For further education?" Abigail nodded. "Partly. My uncle is a professor at a small college there. He offered me a place to live and the opportunity to continue my studies after my parents died." "And now," Griffin's gaze was steady across the fire, "is that still what you want?" Abigail considered the question seriously. "I don't know any more. So much has changed. I still want to honor my father by delivering these documents, but beyond that." She shrugged, uncertain how to express the shifting of her priorities over the past tumultuous days. Griffin nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Life has a way of changing our plans without warning." "Yes," Abigail agreed softly, "though sometimes those changes bring unexpected blessings." Their eyes met across the flames, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had formed so rapidly yet felt increasingly profound. As night deepened, Griffin insisted on taking first watch, despite Abigail's protests that they were relatively safe. "Habit," he explained with a small smile. "Can't seem to shake it." Abigail eventually relented, settling onto her bedroll with a sigh of contentment. The combination of clean clothes, a full stomach, and relative safety made sleep come easily, and she drifted off to the comforting sounds of Griffin moving quietly around their camp. She woke sometime in the night to find Griffin sitting beside her, his back against a fallen log, his rifle across his knees. The fire had burned low, casting his face in shadow, but she could see he was awake, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond their camp. "You should be sleeping," she murmured, sitting up. Griffin turned to her, surprise evident in his expression. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," Abigail assured him, moving to sit beside him. "But you need rest too," Griffin shrugged. "I'm fine." "You're not," Abigail countered gently. "You've barely slept since we met. Please lie down, I'll keep watch for a while." After a moment's hesitation, Griffin nodded, handing her his rifle. "Wake me at the first sign of trouble." "I will," she promised. Griffin stretched out on his bedroll, his hat pulled low over his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened, testament to his exhaustion. Abigail watched him sleep, struck by how much younger he appeared in repose. The constant vigilance temporarily eased from his features. She kept faithful watch through the quiet hours of the night, finding a strange peace in the responsibility. The forest around them was alive with small sounds, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the soft hooting of an owl, the whisper of wind through pine needles. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Griffin stirred, sitting up abruptly as if surprised to find he'd slept at all. "Everything's quiet," Abigail assured him, handing back his rifle. "Not even a coyote to report." Griffin studied her face in the gray light, something softening in his expression. "You let me sleep the whole night." "You needed it," she replied simply. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Thank you." The tender gesture caught Abigail by surprise, and for a breathless moment they simply looked at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then Griffin cleared his throat, dropping his hand as he rose to his feet. "We should get moving," he said, his voice gruffer than usual. "Still a long way to go." The day passed uneventfully as they continued northeast, climbing steadily into higher elevations where the air grew cooler and the forest denser. Abigail found herself studying Griffin's broad back as he rode ahead of her, wondering at the complex man beneath the stoic exterior. By late afternoon, they had reached what Griffin identified as the highest pass they would need to cross. From there, he explained, they would begin their descent toward the high plains that would eventually lead them to Wyoming. They made camp that night on a small plateau with a commanding view of the valley below. As darkness fell, Abigail could see the distant pinpricks of light that marked scattered homesteads and small settlements. "It's beautiful," she remarked, wrapping her new shawl more tightly around her shoulders against the mountain chill. "So vast, yet so alive." Griffin nodded, his gaze following hers across the landscape. "That's what I love about the West, room to breathe, room to be whoever you choose to be without the weight of the past holding you down." "Is that why you stayed?" Abigail asked. "After the war, I mean." "You could have returned to Texas." Griffin was silent for a long moment. "Nothing to return to," he finally said. "And too many ghosts. Out here I found something like peace." "And your ranch in Wyoming, it gives you that peace." A small smile touched Griffin's lips. "Most days. It's hard work and lonely sometimes, but it's mine. Built it with my own hands, nobody telling me what to do or how to live." "It sounds wonderful," Abigail said sincerely. Griffin glanced at her, something like uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "It's not much compared to what you're used to, I expect. Certainly nothing like San Francisco will be." "Perhaps," Abigail allowed, "but I'm beginning to think simple might suit me better than I once believed." Their eyes met across the fire, and Abigail felt the same connection that had been growing between them, a silent understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance. The moment was broken by a sound that froze them both, the distant but unmistakable crack of a rifle, followed by voices carried on the night air. Griffin was on his feet instantly, kicking dirt over their fire while signaling for Abigail to remain silent. In the sudden darkness, he moved to her side, his mouth close to her ear. "Riders in the valley," he whispered. "Moving this way." Fear clutched at Abigail's heart. "The Holdens? Can't be sure, but we can't risk it." Griffin was already gathering their essentials, moving with practiced efficiency despite the darkness. "We need to move. Now." They saddled the horses quickly, working by touch more than sight. Griffin helped Abigail mount, his hands lingering briefly on her waist. "Stay close," he instructed. "Follow exactly where I lead. No matter what happens, if I tell you to run, you ride hard and don't look back. Understood?" "I won't leave you," Abigail protested. Griffin's voice hardened. "Yes, you will, if it comes to that. Promise me." After a moment's hesitation, Abigail nodded, though in her heart, she knew she could never abandon him after all he'd done for her. They set out in near total darkness, Griffin leading them away from their camp along a ridge that offered concealment from the valley below. The going was treacherous, narrow trails winding between massive boulders and dense stands of pine. occasionally opening onto small clearings bathed in starlight before plunging back into shadow. After what felt like hours of tense travel, Griffin finally called a halt in a small ravine sheltered by overhanging rock. "We'll wait here till dawn," he whispered. "Too dangerous to keep moving in the dark." They dismounted, securing the horses to scrubby pines that clung to the ravine walls. There was no question of a fire or even speaking above a whisper. Instead, they huddled together against the cold, sharing Griffin's bedroll for warmth. "You think they tracked us somehow?" Abigail whispered, her lips close to Griffin's ear. "Possibly," he admitted. "Or maybe they realized we'd tricked them and doubled back. Either way, they're too close for comfort." They sat in tense silence, listening to the night sounds, alert for any indication they'd been followed. Eventually, exhaustion overcame vigilance, and Abigail found herself drifting into uneasy sleep, her head resting against Griffin's shoulder. She woke to his gentle touch on her arm and the first gray light of dawn filtering into their shelter. Griffin's expression was grim as he helped her to her feet. "We need to move," he said quietly. "I scouted ahead while you slept. There's a trail leading down to a river valley. If we can cross it, we might lose them in the hills beyond." They rode out as the sun crested the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the landscape. The descent was steep and challenging, with the horses picking their way carefully down game trails never meant for riders. By mid-morning they reached the valley floor, where a swift-flowing river cut through a landscape of scattered cottonwoods and lush grasses. Griffin led them downstream, keeping to the tree line for cover while searching for a safe crossing point. "There," he finally said, pointing to where the river widened and appeared shallower. "We can ford there." They had just reached the water's edge when a shot rang out, the bullet striking a tree trunk inches from Griffin's head. Demon reared, nearly unseating his rider as Griffin wheeled the stallion around, drawing his pistol in one fluid motion. "Ride," he shouted to Abigail, already returning fire toward a stand of trees on the ridge above them. "Cross the river, now." Terrified but determined, Abigail urged Calico into the swift current. The mare balked initially, then plunged forward, water surging around her legs as she fought for footing on the slippery riverbed. Behind her, Abigail could hear the continued exchange of gunfire and Griffin's voice urging Demon after them. She didn't dare look back, focusing instead on guiding Calico through the rushing water toward the opposite bank. They were halfway across when Abigail heard Griffin cry out in pain. She turned in the saddle to see him slumped forward on Demon, one hand pressed to his side while the other still gripped the reins. "Griffin!" she screamed, pulling Calico to a halt despite the dangerous position. "Keep going." He shouted back, his face contorted with pain but his eyes fierce with determination. "I'm right behind you." Torn between obedience and fear for his safety, Abigail reluctantly urged Calico forward, reaching the far bank moments before Griffin and Demon staggered from the water. Griffin's shirt was stained crimson along his left side, but he remained upright in the saddle through sheer will. "Into the trees," he gasped, gesturing toward a dense stand of pines that began where the valley floor met the rising foothills. "Quickly." They rode hard for the shelter of the forest, bullets occasionally kicking up dirt around them as their pursuers fired from the opposite bank. Once within the tree line, Griffin led them deep into the woods, following a winding path that doubled back and crossed rocky ground where they would leave minimal tracks. Only when he was certain they had temporarily eluded their hunters did Griffin finally allow them to stop in a small clearing surrounded by dense undergrowth. He dismounted with difficulty, one hand still pressed to his bleeding side. Abigail was off Calico in an instant, rushing to support him as his knees threatened to buckle. "Let me see," she demanded, helping him to sit against a fallen log. Griffin grimaced as she carefully pulled his blood-soaked shirt away from the wound. The bullet had grazed his side, a deep furrow along his ribs that bled freely, but didn't appear to have penetrated his chest cavity. "Not as bad as it looks," he muttered, though his pallor suggested otherwise. "Don't lie to me," Abigail chided, already tearing strips from her petticoat to create bandages. "You've lost a lot of blood." Working quickly, she cleaned the wound as best she could with water from their canteen, then bound it tightly with the makeshift bandages. Griffin endured her ministrations in stoic silence, though she could feel him tense with pain beneath her gentle hands. "Thank you," he said when she'd finished, his voice rough with exhaustion. Abigail sat back on her heels, studying his face with concern. "You need rest and proper medical attention." Griffin shook his head. "No time. They'll be crossing the river by now, picking up our trail." "You can barely stay upright," Abigail protested. "How do you expect to outride them?" A ghost of a smile touched Griffin's lips. "With your help, I reckon." Despite her fear, Abigail found herself returning his smile. "Then we'd better get moving." "Can you ride?" "Have to," Griffin said simply, allowing her to help him to his feet. They mounted up again, Griffin moving stiffly but determined. Instead of continuing their headlong flight, however, he led them at a more measured pace, conserving strength while employing every trick he knew to confuse their trail, crossing rocky ground, doubling back, even riding down the center of a small stream for nearly half a mile. By late afternoon, Griffin's strength was clearly flagging, his face ashen beneath his tan, his body swaying slightly in the saddle. Abigail rode close beside him, ready to offer support if needed. "There," he finally said, pointing toward what appeared to be an abandoned mine entrance set into a hillside ahead of them. "We can shelter there tonight." The mine proved to be little more than a shallow shaft driven into the hillside, long abandoned by whoever had hoped to find fortune there. But it offered concealment and protection from the elements, which was all they needed. Abigail helped Griffin dismount and settle inside the entrance while she tended to the horses, unsaddling them and securing them where they could graze on the sparse vegetation nearby. By the time she returned, Griffin had managed to create a small fire from branches and debris scattered near the mine entrance. "No sign of pursuit," she reported, crouching beside him. "At least not that I could see." Griffin nodded wearily. "We've bought some time, but they're still coming." "Let me check your wound," Abigail insisted, already reaching for the bandages visible beneath his torn shirt. The injury looked no worse than before, which was something to be grateful for, but Griffin was clearly weakening from blood loss and exhaustion. After rebinding the wound with fresh bandages, Abigail prepared a simple meal from their remaining supplies. "You need to eat," she urged when Griffin seemed inclined to refuse the food, "to keep up your strength." He accepted the plate without further protest, though he ate mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere. "We're about 2 days' ride from the Wyoming border," he said eventually. "If we can cross it, we might find help at Fort Laramie. And if we can't outrun them that long?" Abigail asked, voicing the fear that had been growing as she watched Griffin's condition deteriorate. Griffin's eyes met hers across the small fire. "Then I'll make sure you get away safely." "I won't leave you," Abigail said firmly, reaching across to place her hand over his. "Not now. Not after everything." Something shifted in Griffin's expression, a softening, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Abigail, no," she interrupted. "Don't ask that of me. We stay together. Whatever comes, we face it together." Griffin turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers interlacing naturally. "Why?" he asked softly. Why risk your life for a stranger you met by chance? Abigail's heart pounded in her chest as she recognized the moment for what it was: a crossroads, a choice that would shape whatever future lay ahead of them. "Because you're not a stranger anymore," she said simply. "And because I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Griffin's eyes widened slightly, a mix of disbelief and hope flickering across his features. "Abigail," he began again, his voice hoarse with emotion, "you don't know me, not really." "I know enough," she countered gently. "I know you're brave and honorable. I know you risked your life for mine without hesitation. I know being with you feels right in a way nothing ever has before." Griffin's grip on her hand tightened. "You deserve better than a broken-down cowboy with nothing but a small ranch and too many ghosts." "Let me decide what I deserve," Abigail said, moving to kneel beside him. "And what I want." For a long moment, Griffin simply looked at her, searching her eyes as if for confirmation of what he'd heard. Then, with aching slowness, he raised his free hand to cup her cheek. "I've been falling since the moment you walked into my camp," he admitted quietly. "Never thought I'd have the right to say so." Abigail turned her face into his palm, heart soaring despite their perilous circumstances. "You have every right." When their lips finally met, it was with a tenderness that belied the danger surrounding them. Griffin's kiss was gentle, almost reverent, as if he feared she might disappear at his touch. Abigail responded with all the emotion that had been building within her: gratitude, admiration, and the love that had grown from the seeds of their shared journey. When they finally parted, Griffin rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "If we get through this," he murmured, "would you consider coming to Wyoming, not to your uncle's but to my ranch? It's not much, but—" "Yes," Abigail interrupted, her decision already made. "Yes, I would." A smile transformed Griffin's face, erasing years of hardship and loneliness. "Then I have something worth fighting for." They spent the night huddled together near the fire, finding comfort in each other's presence despite the uncertainty that awaited them. Abigail insisted on taking watch while Griffin slept, knowing he needed rest to recover his strength. As she gazed out at the star-filled sky, she found herself praying for their safety with a fervor she hadn't felt since her parents' deaths. Morning brought renewed determination and a plan. Griffin, looking somewhat stronger after his night's rest, spread their tattered map on the ground between them. "We're here," he said, indicating their approximate position. "Fort Laramie is here. Between us lies open country, harder to hide but easier to make speed." "And the Holdens?" Abigail asked. "They'll expect us to keep to cover forests, hills. That's where they'll concentrate their search." Griffin traced a route across the map with his finger. "If we ride hard across open ground, we might reach the fort before they realize what we've done." It was a desperate gamble, but Abigail saw the logic in it. "Then that's what we'll do." They set out as the sun crested the eastern horizon, leaving the shelter of the foothills for the rolling grasslands beyond. Griffin rode with renewed purpose despite his injury, and Abigail matched his pace, both of them pushing their mounts as hard as they dared. By midday, they had covered significant ground, the mountains receding behind them as the landscape opened into the vast expanse of the high plains. They paused briefly to rest the horses and eat a sparse meal, then continued their journey as clouds began to gather on the western horizon. "Storm coming," Griffin observed, studying the darkening sky. "Could work in our favor, cover our tracks, make it harder for them to follow." Abigail nodded, though the prospect of being caught in open country during a storm was hardly appealing. "How much farther to the fort?" "If we keep this pace, we could reach it by tomorrow afternoon," Griffin estimated, "assuming no unexpected delays." They rode on as the wind began to rise, carrying the scent of rain. By late afternoon, the storm was upon them, not the brief, violent downpour of desert regions, but a steady, soaking rain that quickly turned the ground beneath their horses' hooves to mud. Despite the discomfort, they pushed forward, both knowing that stopping would only delay their reaching safety. Abigail's new dress was soon soaked through, clinging to her skin, while Griffin's hat provided minimal protection against the driving rain. As dusk approached, bringing with it an even heavier downpour, Griffin finally signaled for them to seek shelter. A stand of cottonwoods near a swollen creek offered some protection from the elements, and they gratefully dismounted, both stiff and chilled from hours in the saddle. "We'll wait it out," Griffin decided, leading the horses beneath the largest tree. Too dangerous to continue in this weather. They huddled together beneath Griffin's slicker, which he insisted Abigail wear while he made do with his damp coat. Despite their miserable conditions, Abigail found comfort in his proximity, his arm around her shoulders providing warmth that had nothing to do with physical heat. "When this is over," she said softly, "and we're safe at your ranch, what then?" Griffin's arm tightened around her. "Then we build a life, if that's what you want, together." "It's what I want," Abigail assured him, resting her head against his shoulder. "More than anything." As night fell, the storm finally began to abate, the steady downpour giving way to a gentle drizzle. They ate cold rations, too tired and wet to attempt a fire, then settled as comfortably as possible against the trunk of the massive cottonwood. "Try to sleep," Griffin murmured, pulling her close against his side. "Tomorrow will be another long day." Despite their uncomfortable circumstances, Abigail found herself drifting off, lulled by Griffin's steady presence and the rhythmic sound of rain dripping from the leaves above them. She woke to his urgent whisper and a hand covering her mouth. "Don't move," he breathed against her ear. Riders approaching. Fully alert now, Abigail tensed, listening to the sounds that had alerted Griffin, the muffled thud of hooves on wet ground, the jingle of tack and men's voices carried on the pre-dawn air. "Must have headed for the fort," one voice was saying. "No other reason to leave the high country." "If they reach Fort Laramie, we lose our chance," another replied, the voice chillingly familiar even at a distance. "Find them before then or don't bother coming back. Holden." Abigail's blood ran cold at the sound of the man who had pursued them so relentlessly. Griffin's arm tightened around her, his body coiled with tension as they remained absolutely still beneath the cottonwood's sheltering branches. The riders passed within 50 yards of their hiding place, 5 men moving at a steady trot despite the muddy conditions. In the gray light of early dawn, Abigail could make out the distinctive figure of Luke Holden at their head, a tall man with a scarred face and an air of menace even at a distance. Only when the riders had disappeared from sight did Griffin release the breath he'd been holding. "They're ahead of us," he whispered, "cutting off our route to the fort." Abigail's heart sank. "What do we do now?" Griffin's expression was grim but determined. "Change plans. Head west, then north. There's a trading post on the North Platte River. Might find help there." They waited until full daylight before moving, Griffin insisting on caution despite their desire to put distance between themselves and the Holden gang. When they finally mounted up, Abigail noticed Griffin's face was flushed despite the morning chill. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked with concern. "Fine," he replied shortly, though the tightness around his eyes told a different story. "Just need to keep moving." They rode west through the sodden landscape, the recent storm having transformed the prairie into a sea of mud that sucked at their horses' hooves and slowed their progress considerably. By midday, Griffin's condition had visibly deteriorated, his face pale beneath the flush of fever, his body occasionally swaying in the saddle. "We need to stop," Abigail finally insisted when he nearly fell during a brief dismount to check their direction. "Your wound is infected." Griffin shook his head stubbornly. "Can't stop. Not yet." But nature had other plans. As they crested a low rise, Griffin suddenly slumped forward, only his grip on the saddle horn preventing him from falling. Abigail was off Calico in an instant, reaching him just as consciousness fled entirely. With strength born of desperation, she managed to ease him from the saddle before he could fall. He was burning with fever, his shirt damp with sweat and fresh blood where the wound had reopened. "Griffin," she called, patting his face gently. "Griffin, wake up." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and bright with fever. "Abigail," he murmured, "sorry, should have been stronger." "Hush," she soothed, tears pricking her eyes. "You're the strongest man I've ever known." Looking around desperately, Abigail spotted what appeared to be an abandoned sod house in the distance, little more than a low, earthen mound with a sagging door, but shelter nonetheless. With renewed determination, she managed to get Griffin back onto Demon, mounting behind him to keep him upright as they made their slow way toward the structure. The sod house proved to be long abandoned, its roof partially collapsed, and its interior damp from the recent rains. But it offered concealment and some protection from the elements, which was all Abigail could hope for at the moment. With considerable effort, she got Griffin inside and laid him on her bedroll, which she'd spread on the driest patch of earth she could find. His skin burned beneath her touch as she carefully removed his shirt to examine the wound. The sight that greeted her filled her with dread. The bullet graze was inflamed and seeping, clear signs of infection that explained his rapidly deteriorating condition. Without proper medical attention, Griffin's chances were grim. Fighting back panic, Abigail forced herself to think clearly. She had basic knowledge of herbal remedies from her mother, who had often treated minor illnesses and injuries on their farm. Looking around the abandoned dwelling, she spotted what she needed: a small patch of yarrow growing near the collapsed portion of the roof, where rainwater had created a damp environment. Working quickly, she gathered the yarrow and some pine resin from trees she'd noticed nearby. Returning to Griffin's side, she set about creating a poultice, chewing the yarrow leaves to release their medicinal properties before applying them directly to the infected wound. "This will help draw out the infection," she explained, though she wasn't sure Griffin could hear her through his fever-induced haze. "You need to hold on, Griffin. Please hold on." Throughout the afternoon and into the evening, Abigail tended to him relentlessly, bathing his face with cool water from their canteens, changing the poultice when it grew warm, and coaxing him to swallow small sips of water whenever he surfaced briefly from delirium. As night fell, bringing with it a bone-deep chill, she lay beside him, sharing her body heat and whispering words of encouragement and love. "Don't leave me," she pleaded softly. "We have a future to build, remember, a life together." Sometime in the darkest hours of the night, Griffin's fever finally broke. Abigail woke from a light doze to find his skin cooler to the touch, his breathing more regular. When she placed a gentle hand on his cheek, his eyes opened, clear and focused for the first time in hours. "Abigail," he murmured, recognition and relief in his voice. Tears sprang to her eyes. "You're back," she whispered, pressing her forehead to his. A weak smile touched his lips. "Never left," he assured her. "Just took a little detour." Relief made her almost giddy. "Don't you dare scare me like that again, Griffin Wade." "Yes, madam," he replied, his voice gaining strength with each word. "How long was I out?" "Most of a day," Abigail told him, helping him sip from the canteen. "The wound is infected, but I think the worst has passed." Griffin nodded, wincing slightly as he shifted position. "The Holdens." "No sign of them," Abigail assured him. "But they're between us and Fort Laramie." "The trading post," Griffin remembered. "Still our best option. How far are we?" "I'm not sure," Abigail admitted. "I was more concerned with finding shelter than keeping track of our location." Griffin attempted to sit up, grimacing with the effort. "Need to check the map." "What you need is rest," Abigail countered firmly, gently pressing him back down. "The map will wait until morning." Too weak to argue, Griffin subsided, though concern still furrowed his brow. "We can't stay here long." "I know," Abigail soothed, "but one night won't make the difference, not in your condition." Despite his protests, Griffin soon drifted back to sleep, his body demanding the rest it needed to heal. Abigail kept vigil beside him, alternating between watching the doorway for signs of danger and monitoring his condition for any return of fever. By morning, Griffin was notably stronger, though still far from his usual robust self. The wound looked less angry when Abigail changed the poultice, and he was able to sit up and eat a small portion of their dwindling supplies. "We need to move," he insisted after consulting their map. "The trading post is about a day's ride northwest of here. If we start now, we might reach it by nightfall tomorrow." Abigail wanted to argue that he wasn't ready for such a journey, but she knew their options were limited. Their supplies were running low, and remaining in one place too long increased the risk of discovery by the Holdens. "All right," she conceded. "But you ride with me on Demon. He's stronger and can carry us both for a while. We'll lead Calico." To her surprise, Griffin didn't argue, a testament to how weak he still felt despite his determination. With careful movements, they gathered their meager belongings and prepared to leave the shelter that had served them in their hour of need. Outside, the day was clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. The muddy ground had begun to dry under the sun's influence, which would make travel easier but also leave clearer tracks for anyone following them. Griffin insisted on mounting Demon himself, though he accepted Abigail's help more readily than he might have days earlier. She swung up behind him, her arms circling his waist to support him as they set out across the rolling grassland. They traveled slowly but steadily throughout the day, Griffin gradually regaining strength as they went. By evening, when they made camp in a shallow ravine that offered some concealment, he was able to move with greater ease, though fatigue was evident in every line of his body. "You should have let me in Wyoming," he remarked as they shared a sparse meal. "Wouldn't be in this mess." Abigail shook her head firmly. "No, if I hadn't met you, I'd likely be dead by now, and I certainly wouldn't have found something worth more than any safety San Francisco might offer." Griffin's eyes softened as he reached for her hand. "And what's that, love?" Abigail said simply. "A future with someone who sees me for who I am, not who they expect me to be." Griffin's fingers tightened around hers. "When I told you I didn't want to sleep alone that first night," he said quietly, "I meant it more than I realized. Somehow I knew, even then, that you were going to change everything." Abigail moved closer, fitting herself against his side as naturally as if they'd been together for years rather than days. "For me too," she whispered. "From the moment you helped me when you had every reason to send me away." They slept close together that night, finding comfort in each other's presence despite the dangers that still pursued them. And if their kisses held a new urgency, a deeper promise, neither commented on it, each understanding that their future together, while fervently desired, was still far from certain. Morning brought renewed determination and a plan. Griffin, looking considerably stronger, studied their surroundings with a critical eye. "We need to change tactics," he decided. "They're expecting us to head for settlements or military posts. What if we double back instead?" Return to the mountains, lose ourselves in the wilderness until they give up the search. Abigail considered the suggestion. Will they give up? Eventually, Griffin said with a nod. Even the Holdens can't hunt forever. They have other business, other priorities. And the documents? Abigail asked, touching the oilskin packet she still carried. My father died gathering this evidence. I can't just abandon the purpose he gave his last days to. Griffin's expression softened. We won't abandon it. Once the Holdens move on, we can make our way to Cheyenne. There's a federal marshal there who's honest, a man named Harrison. He'd ensure the evidence reaches the right hands. The plan made sense, and Abigail found herself nodding agreement. How do we lose them in the mountains? A slow smile spread across Griffin's face. That's where being raised by a trapper comes in handy. I know tricks they've never dreamed of. They set out with renewed purpose, heading west toward the distant mountains rather than continuing northwest to the trading post. Griffin rode Demon now, his strength returning steadily while Abigail followed on Calico, both alert for any sign of pursuit. By midday, they had reached the first foothills, where scattered pines offered increased cover. Griffin led them on a winding path, occasionally doubling back or taking unexpected turns that would confuse anyone attempting to follow their trail. As they climbed higher, the landscape grew increasingly rugged, with steep slopes and narrow game trails testing both their horsemanship and their mounts' surefootedness. By evening, they had reached a small plateau sheltered by towering pines, where Griffin called a halt. We'll camp here tonight, he decided, dismounting with far greater ease than the previous day. There's a spring nearby for water, and we're high enough to see anyone approaching from below. They made camp efficiently, working together with the easy coordination of partners who had learned each other's rhythms. As twilight deepened around them, they sat close together near a small fire, the vast landscape spread below them like a tapestry. It's strange, Abigail mused, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. A week ago I was terrified, running for my life. Now, despite still being hunted, I feel at peace. Griffin's arm tightened around her shoulders. Because we're together, he said simply. Facing it together makes all the difference. Abigail nodded, turning to study his profile in the firelight. I've been thinking about what happens after, when we're finally safe. And, Griffin prompted when she hesitated. I want to go to Wyoming with you, she said firmly. Not just temporarily, but permanently. Griffin's expression grew serious as he turned to face her fully. Are you sure? It's a hard life, Abigail, isolated, nothing like what you're accustomed to. I'm sure, she replied without hesitation. The life I was accustomed to ended when my parents died. Now I want to build something new, something real. With you. For a long moment, Griffin simply looked at her, as if memorizing every feature of her face. Then, with deliberate movements, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that gleamed dully in the firelight. This was my mother's, he said, holding up a simple gold ring. I've carried it since the day she died, thinking someday I might find someone worthy of wearing it. Abigail's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the significance of the moment. I know this isn't how most women dream of being proposed to, Griffin continued, a hint of uncertainty in his voice for the first time since she'd met him. On the run in the wilderness with nothing to offer but an uncertain future and a heart that's been alone too long. It's perfect, Abigail whispered, tears gathering in her eyes, because it's real, because it's you. Griffin took her hand gently in his. Abigail Montgomery, will you marry me? Will you share my life, whatever it brings, and never let me sleep alone again? Yes, she answered without hesitation, her heart overflowing. Yes to all of it. The ring slid onto her finger as if it had been made for her. And when Griffin pulled her into his arms, his kiss held all the promise of the future they would build together, a future neither had imagined possible just days before. That night, beneath the vast canopy of stars, they made love for the first time tentatively at first, then with increasing passion as they discovered each other's bodies with the same care and attention they'd learned of each other's hearts. In Griffin's arms, Abigail found a completion she hadn't known she was seeking, while Griffin discovered that the emptiness he'd carried for so long could indeed be filled by the right woman's love. Morning found them tangled together beneath Griffin's bedroll, reluctant to face the day and the dangers it might bring. But practicality eventually won out, and they rose to continue their journey deeper into the mountains, where Griffin knew of valleys and hidden canyons where they could disappear, until the hunt for them grew cold. For 3 days, they traveled the high country, following game trails and ancient Indian paths that few white men had ever seen. Griffin taught Abigail the ways of the wilderness, how to move without leaving sign, how to find water in seemingly barren places, how to read the landscape for both danger and opportunity. On the 4th day, as they crested a ridge overlooking a secluded valley where Griffin proposed they make a temporary camp, Abigail spotted movement in the trees below, not the natural swaying of branches in the wind, but the deliberate progress of riders moving with stealth. "Griffin," she whispered urgently, pointing toward the barely perceptible disturbance. His eyes narrowed as he studied the valley floor. "Holden's," he confirmed grimly. "They're better trackers than I gave them credit for." They retreated hastily, leading their horses away from the ridge before they could be spotted. Once safely concealed among dense pines, Griffin spread their map on the ground between them. "We're here," he said, indicating their position. "The Holdens are here, moving up the valley. If we circle around this way," his finger traced a route across the map, "we might be able to slip past them and head for Cheyenne directly." It was a desperate gamble, but with the Holdens closing in, they had few options left. Mounting up, they set out on the new route, pushing their tired horses as hard as they dared through the rugged terrain. By nightfall, they had reached a high pass that marked the eastern edge of the mountain range. Beyond lay rolling foothills that would eventually give way to the high plains where Cheyenne stood. If they could cross that open country without being caught, they might finally reach safety. They made a cold camp that night, unwilling to risk a fire that might be seen from a distance. Huddled together for warmth, they shared the last of their provisions and whispered plans for the dash across open country that would begin at first light. "Once we reach Cheyenne," Griffin said softly, his lips close to Abigail's ear, "we'll find Marshal Harrison first, then a preacher." Abigail smiled in the darkness, her hand finding his. "And then Wyoming, and then home," Griffin confirmed, the word carrying all the promise of their future together. Dawn broke clear and cold, with a biting wind sweeping down from the higher peaks. They set out as the first light painted the eastern sky, leading their horses down from the pass until the terrain allowed for riding. The descent was faster than their climb had been, and by mid-morning they had reached the transition zone where mountains gave way to foothills. The landscape opened before them, beautiful but terrifying in its exposure after days in the sheltering forest. 2 days to Cheyenne if we push hard, Griffin estimated, studying the distant horizon. "No place to hide out there." "Then we don't hide," Abigail said with determination. "We run." And run they did, setting a pace that tested both their endurance and that of their faithful mounts. They rode through the day with only brief stops to rest the horses, covering ground with the desperate energy of those who can see salvation on the horizon. As evening approached, bringing with it the threat of another cold night in the open, They spotted a welcome sight, a small ranch nestled in a protected hollow, with smoke rising cheerfully from its chimney. "What do you think?" Abigail asked, nodding toward the homestead. "Friend or foe?" Griffin studied the peaceful scene thoughtfully. "Hard to say, but we need supplies and rest if we're going to make it to Cheyenne." They approached cautiously, Griffin's hand never far from his pistol as they rode into the yard. A man emerged from the barn at the sound of their horses, tall and weathered, with a shock of white hair beneath a battered hat. "Evening, travelers," he called, his tone friendly but his eyes shrewd as they took in Griffin's haggard appearance and Abigail's evident exhaustion. "Looking for something? Just a place to rest our horses," Griffin replied carefully, "and perhaps purchase some supplies if you're willing to sell." The man studied them for a long moment, then nodded. "Name's Peterson, Samuel Peterson. The missus has supper nearly ready, and there's room in the barn for your mounts." He paused, then added with deliberate casualness, "Had some other visitors yesterday. Men asking about a couple heading east, told them I hadn't seen anyone." Griffin and Abigail exchanged a quick glance, understanding the message. This man had already encountered the Holdens and chosen not to help them. "Much obliged," Griffin said simply, dismounting and helping Abigail down. "I'm Griffin Wade. This is my fiancée, Abigail Montgomery." Peterson nodded, a hint of a smile touching his weathered face. "Pleased to meet you both. Come on in. Martha sets a good table." The farmhouse was small but immaculately kept, with braided rugs on plank floors and curtains at the windows. Martha Peterson, a plump woman with kind eyes and capable hands, welcomed them with genuine warmth, clucking over their obvious fatigue and ushering them to seats at a well-scrubbed table. Over a hearty meal of roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh baked bread, they shared a carefully edited version of their story, enough truth to explain their condition without revealing the full danger of their situation. "Those men who came through," Samuel remarked as they finished eating, "they didn't strike me as the law, despite what they claimed. Had a mean look about them." "They're not the law," Griffin confirmed. "They're hired guns working for men who want certain evidence to disappear." Samuel nodded, unsurprised, thought as much, told Martha after they left that they had the stink of trouble about them. "We're trying to reach Cheyenne," Abigail explained. "There's a marshal there who will help us." "Harrison?" Samuel asked, and when Griffin nodded, he continued, "Good man. Honest. But Cheyenne's still a fair ride from here, and those men seem determined." "We'll manage," Griffin assured him, though fatigue was evident in every line of his body despite the nourishing meal. Martha exchanged a glance with her husband, then spoke firmly. "Not tonight, you won't. You're both dead on your feet. We have a spare room. You'll stay the night and start fresh in the morning." Abigail opened her mouth to protest, unwilling to bring danger to this kind couple's doorstep, but Samuel raised a hand to forestall her. "We've been on this land for 30 years, he said simply. "Seen all kinds of trouble come and go. We can handle ourselves and we know right from wrong. You'll stay." Too exhausted to argue further, Griffin and Abigail gratefully accepted the offered hospitality. The small guest room, with its patchwork quilt and feather pillows, seemed like luxury after days on the trail. "These are good people," Abigail murmured as they prepared for their first night in a real bed since their ordeal began. "Taking such a risk for strangers." "The best kind of people," Griffin agreed, drawing her into his arms. "The kind that remind you there's still good in this world, despite the Holdens in it." They slept deeply, secure in the knowledge that for one night at least, someone else was keeping watch. Morning came too soon, with the smell of coffee and bacon drawing them from their rest. Martha had packed provisions for their journey: bread, cheese, jerky, and even some apple tarts wrapped carefully in cloth. Samuel offered fresh horses, but Griffin refused, unwilling to part the man from his livelihood. "Our mounts will see us through," he insisted. "They've earned the right to carry us home." As they prepared to depart, Samuel took Griffin aside while Martha fussed over Abigail, ensuring she had a warm shawl for the journey. "There's a shortcut to Cheyenne," the older man explained, sketching a rough map in the dirt of the yard. "Takes you through Miller's Canyon. It's narrow and rough in places, but it cuts nearly half a day off the journey." Griffin studied the route carefully, committing it to memory. "We're in your debt," he said simply. Samuel waved away the thanks. "Just do right by that young woman. She looks at you like you hung the moon." A smile touched Griffin's lips. "I aim to spend my life trying to deserve that look." They set out with renewed determination, their spirits lifted by the Petersons' kindness and their bodies strengthened by proper rest and nourishing food. Following Samuel's directions, they found the entrance to Miller's Canyon by mid-morning, a narrow break in a line of low hills that would have been easy to miss without specific guidance. The canyon proved as challenging as Samuel had warned, a winding passage between steep walls, with a rocky floor that demanded careful navigation. But it was well worth the difficulty for the time it saved, and by afternoon they had emerged onto more open country, with Cheyenne now less than a day's ride away. They pushed on until dusk, making camp in a small hollow that offered some protection from the wind. As they shared the food Martha had provided, Griffin noticed Abigail repeatedly touching the ring on her finger, a small smile playing about her lips. "Having second thoughts?" he asked lightly, though a hint of genuine concern underlay the question. Abigail looked up in surprise. "Quite the opposite," she assured him. "I was thinking how strange life is, how the worst day of my life, when the stagecoach was attacked, led to the best decision I've ever made." Griffin moved to sit beside her, drawing her close against his side. "When I told you I didn't want to sleep alone that night," he said softly, "I had no idea how completely you would change my life." "For the better, I hope," Abigail murmured, resting her head on his shoulder. "In every way," Griffin confirmed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You've given me something I'd stopped believing in, a future worth fighting for." They set out at first light, both aware that they were making their final push toward safety. The landscape rolled away before them, the distant smudge on the horizon gradually resolving into the scattered buildings of Cheyenne as they approached. It was mid-afternoon when they finally rode into the bustling frontier town, a far cry from the small settlements and isolated homesteads they had encountered on their journey. Streets bustled with activity, with freight wagons, cowboys, and townspeople going about their business under the watchful eyes of both the local sheriff and the territorial authorities. Griffin led them directly to the marshal's office, a sturdy brick building near the center of town. Inside, they found Marshal Harrison, a tall, lean man with penetrating eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that softened slightly as Griffin explained their situation. "The Holdens, eh?" the marshal said, examining the documents Abigail had carried so far at such cost. "Been wanting to get something on them and their employers for years. This might just do it." "Will it be enough?" Abigail asked anxiously. "My father died gathering that evidence." Harrison nodded solemnly. "It's enough to start an investigation, madam. And once these fellows realize we're looking into them, others might find the courage to come forward. Your father's work won't be wasted." Relief washed over Abigail, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. Griffin's arm came around her shoulders, steadying her as it had so many times during their journey. "What about the Holdens themselves?" Griffin asked. "They're still hunting us." "Not for long," Harrison assured them grimly. "I've got deputies I can trust. We'll find them before they find you." True to his word, the marshal immediately dispatched riders to watch the approaches to town, while arranging safe accommodation for Griffin and Abigail at a small hotel owned by a former deputy. "Stay there," he instructed. "Don't wander about town until we've dealt with the Holdens. I'll send word when it's safe." The hotel room, though simple, seemed like unimaginable luxury after their days on the trail. A real bed, clean linens, a wash basin with fresh water, and the promise of hot meals delivered to their door all combined to create a sanctuary where they could finally begin to relax. "It doesn't seem real," Abigail murmured as they stood together by the window, watching the activity on the street below. "That we're actually safe." Griffin's arms encircled her from behind, his chin resting lightly on her head. "Not quite yet," he reminded her gently, "but soon." They spent 2 days in comfortable confinement, using the time to rest and recover from their ordeal. On the morning of the 3rd day, a knock at their door revealed Marshal Harrison, his expression satisfied. "It's over," he announced without preamble. "Caught the Holdens trying to sneak into town last night, all 4 of them, including Luke himself." Relief flooded through Abigail, so intense she had to sit down. "They're in custody, under lock and key," Harrison confirmed. "And with the evidence you provided, they'll be staying there for a good long while." Griffin extended his hand to the marshal. "We're in your debt." Harrison shook the offered hand firmly. "Just doing my job, though I wouldn't say no to an invitation to the wedding if you're still planning one." Griffin's eyebrows rose in surprise. "How did you?" The marshal smiled, nodding toward Abigail's hand where his mother's ring gleamed. "Wasn't hard to figure out. Besides, the way you two look at each other tells the story plain enough." A flush rose in Abigail's cheeks, but she couldn't deny the truth of the observation. "We were hoping to find a preacher here in Cheyenne, actually." "Well, now," Harrison said, his smile broadening, "as it happens, my brother-in-law is the minister at the little church on Pine Street. I reckon he could be persuaded to perform a ceremony on short notice for the folks who helped bring down the Holden gang." And so it was that, 2 days later, Abigail Montgomery became Abigail Wade in a simple ceremony attended by Marshal Harrison, his family, and a few trusted deputies. She wore a new dress of pale blue silk, Griffin's wedding gift, purchased with the last of his funds, and carried wildflowers gathered by the marshal's young daughter. As they exchanged vows in the small, sunlit church, Abigail found herself marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From terror and desperation had grown a love deeper and truer than anything she could have imagined when she first stumbled into Griffin's camp. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, his kind face beaming with genuine pleasure at the obvious devotion between the couple before him. "You may kiss your bride." Griffin's kiss was tender yet possessive, a promise of all the years they would share. When they finally parted, his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Wade?" he asked softly. "More than ready," she assured him, her hand finding his as they turned to face their future together. The journey to Griffin's ranch in Wyoming took another week, a peaceful journey this time, unmarked by pursuit or danger. They traveled at an easy pace, taking time to enjoy each other's company and the beautiful landscape that would now be Abigail's home as well. When they finally crested the last rise and Griffin's ranch came into view, Abigail's breath caught at the simple beauty of the place. A sturdy log cabin nestled against a backdrop of rolling hills, with corrals, a small barn, and a creek winding through lush pastureland where cattle grazed contentedly. "It's not much," Griffin said, echoing his words from days earlier, though now there was pride rather than apology in his tone. "It's perfect," Abigail replied sincerely, her hand tightening on his. "It's home." As they rode into the yard, an elderly man emerged from the cabin. "Walter Jenkins," Griffin explained, the neighbor who had been watching over the place during his absence. The old cowboy's weathered face split in a grin of welcome, his eyes widening in surprise at the sight of Abigail. "Well now," he drawled as Griffin helped Abigail dismount, "seems you found more than your brother's grave down in Arizona, boy." Griffin's arm slid around Abigail's waist, drawing her close to his side. "Walter, meet my wife, Abigail." "Wife," Walter exclaimed, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Well, that's a surprise worth coming home to. Pleased to meet you, madam." "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Jenkins," Abigail replied warmly, "and thank you for looking after our home. Our home." The words felt right on her tongue, natural and true. Walter stayed only long enough to share a quick meal and hear an abbreviated version of their adventures before tactfully taking his leave, promising to return in a few days to help Griffin with some necessary repairs to the corral. Alone at last, Griffin led Abigail through the cabin that would now be their home. It was simple but solid, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, a small bedroom, and a lean-to that Griffin explained would make a fine second bedroom when the need arises. The implication brought a blush to Abigail's cheeks, but a smile to her lips. The thought of Griffin's children, was one she had already begun to cherish. As evening fell, they sat together on the small porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Griffin's arm was around her shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him, as if they had been sitting thus for years rather than days. "Happy?" he asked softly, his lips brushing her temple. "Completely," Abigail assured him, turning to meet his gaze. "I never imagined finding such happiness, especially not after losing my parents. It seemed like my life was over before it had really begun." "And now," Griffin prompted, his eyes warm in the fading light. Abigail smiled, reaching up to trace the beloved lines of his face. "Now I know it was just beginning. The real journey was finding you." Griffin captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "When I told you I didn't want to sleep alone that night," he said softly, "I had no idea I was really saying I wanted to spend the rest of my life with you. But somehow I think my heart knew." "Mine too," Abigail whispered, leaning into his embrace. "And I never will sleep alone again, not for all the nights we have left." As darkness settled around their small homestead, they moved inside to begin their life together, a life born of danger and desperation, but destined to be filled with love, laughter, and the quiet joy of two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed most. In the years that followed, the Wade Ranch prospered, growing from a small homestead to a respectable spread that drew favorable comment from neighbors and visitors alike. Griffin's skill with cattle and Abigail's shrewd management of their finances proved a winning combination, allowing them to expand their holdings and improve their home. Their family grew as well, with the arrival of a son in their second year of marriage and twin daughters 2 years later. The cabin expanded accordingly, with Griffin adding rooms as their needs changed, until it became a proper ranch house that Abigail filled with books, music, and laughter. Marshall Harrison remained a friend, visiting whenever his duties brought him to their part of Wyoming. It was during one such visit, as they sat on the expanded porch watching the children play in the yard, that he brought news of the final resolution of the case that had brought Griffin and Abigail together. "The last of them was sentenced yesterday," he reported with satisfaction. 10 years hard labor for fraud and conspiracy. Your father's evidence was the cornerstone of the case, Abigail. He'd be proud." Abigail leaned against Griffin's shoulder, watching their son show the Marshall's youngest boy how to spin a small top. "I like to think he would be proud of all of it," she said softly. "The justice, yes, but also the life we've built here." Griffin's arm tightened around her waist, his expression tender as he gazed down at her. "I know he would be," he assured her. How could he not be proud of the woman who crossed half the territory with a price on her head, just to see justice done? Abigail smiled, remembering those desperate days that now seemed like a lifetime ago. "We've come a long way from that first night by your campfire." "That we have," Griffin agreed. "But I meant what I said then, you know. I didn't want to sleep alone that night or any night after." His voice softened, meant for her ears alone. "And thanks to you, I never have again." As the sun set on another day in the life they had built together, Abigail knew with absolute certainty that the desperate flight that had brought her to Griffin's campfire had been, in the most unexpected way, the greatest blessing of her life. From those dangerous beginnings had grown a love strong enough to weather any storm, and a family that was the living embodiment of that love, and she had never slept alone again.